I want to open our discussion with perhaps a question that is most appropriately asked to you, Ms. Paulus. I was excited to hear that you've begun to really push for new approaches to funding and to sponsorship of clinical trials that may not be bound by patent or bound by intellectual property protections, and really probing the mechanisms for developing alternative models to vaccine development. Is there anything in particular that you would propose to help motivate the policies, both within the EU and perhaps in other governing bodies around the world, to build infrastructure for vaccine access, and more fundamentally to the access to access to the research and development tools that make vaccines possible?
Well, actually, as I said at the very beginning, the problem is that people cannot really imagine that something is possible besides the classical patenting and stuff, So that was maybe the biggest obstacle, that people tended to not understand the concept behind this open access, and also behind the concept of being able to adapt the vaccines very quickly. Although, of course, the same principle is there when we're talking about the mRNA, because this is also adaptable very, very quickly, and probably BioNTech, Pfizer will not have to do a total recast of the respective clinical trials, because of course a lot of work has already been done. So it was basically, to my perception, it was a problem of people not quite understanding the concept, and not willing to think out of the box. I mean, when I recall DG Sante, they were like, oh, this sounds great, but where is the market authorization holder? Where is the applicant? So there is no room in the current system to approach something rather in a new way, so to speak. But to be honest, I do have a further question, because what I did not quite understand is the approach or your approach on the clinical trial. What is the deciding difference that makes it more feasible, or easier, or cheaper, or what is the crucial point? Sorry for not grasping it right away.
That's a fantastic question. I think developing that distinction, articulating that distinction between, what is it about challenge trials in particular that makes them more accessible and more a lower cost, lower barrier to initiating them? What is it that really sets them apart from the current sort of gold standard? So I think we have a number of panelists here who could sort of expertly answer that question. I wonder if perhaps Dr. Eyal, you'd like to jump in on that.
Thank you. I think actually the question of cost is not that straightforward. There would probably be lower cost than a 60,000 participant trial, which gives us statistically the same number. I mean, the statistical power of field trials relies on the number of cases of actual infection in them. And the number of cases is of a similar scale, in fact, needs for reasons to be slightly larger than in challenge trials, but it's the same scale. So you get confirmation that you will have those cases in a challenge trial, even if you enlist only 50, 100 participants. So that's certainly a huge difference in cost and time. You don't need to wait months for people to gradually start getting infected, start getting exposed and potentially infected. That said, there are some expenses that exist in challenge trials that don't exist in field trials. For example, to do challenge trials properly, you need to isolate individuals who participate to protect the community from getting infected by them. And that, you host people, you feed them, and for weeks on end, that costs money. For me, I don't know if it's exactly cost, but the thing that currently makes it fairly impossible to do field trials and continues to be possible in challenge trials is that we have authorized vaccines at this point. So in a field trial where you have 40,000 people with a control arm of, half of that, you've just invited from a community, and the field trials need to happen in an area where there is a lot of community spread of the virus. Otherwise, you won't get enough exposures. So unlike a challenge trial, which takes people to wherever, to some research center, it isolates them there. It can be in a city with a lot of infections. It can be in a city without many infections. They can come from an area with a lot of infections. They can come from another area. It doesn't matter. Right? In a field trial, you've got this huge placebo arm of individuals who are being told, please, if you ever get access in the coming months to the authorized vaccine, please say no if you're willing. All these people are being sent, are being recruited from an area of high community spread. It affects the surrounding community in a major way, in a way that is not really relevant at all in challenge trials. So there is this picture in some of the publications that challenge trials somehow are dangerous for the surrounding community. It's exactly the mirror image of that. Field trials at this point, where we have authorized vaccines that are gradually being distributed, would be really hard to accept from a public health standpoint for the surrounding community. And that's why we currently in the US, there have been some plans for field trials to check the impact on teenagers, whatever. They were not authorized, or to check different dosing regimens. They were not approved because of these ethical concerns about involving placebo control. That is really much less of a problem in challenge trials. So for me, from a logistical feasibility standpoint, that's a major factor.
And I'd just like to interject a remark on Dr. Eyal's statement. I think challenge trials will be very expensive if they're very rare. But if we learn how to do them, they're more common. I think we can make them, we can scale challenge trials very similarly to the way that we scale other things. We can make them much less expensive by sharing information and protocols, and by having a ready source of volunteers for challenge trials and people who know how to run challenge trials. So I think a lot of that upfront expense will diminish greatly over time. The other thing is that with placebo control, we're actually completely corrupting the endpoints of the placebo design by allowing, as you mentioned, the expectation at the beginning of the trial is that the placebo will not get vaccinated, but they are getting vaccinated, right? And even the companies and public health officials are supporting their vaccination. So there was this fantasy design that they would go to the end of the trial without getting vaccinated, but that's not happening.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So the cost can be measured both in dollars and really in time, right? And as we are in a global pandemic, time can thus be measured in human lives. So I think that's an interesting sort of way of addressing the bottom line and the cost of various clinical trial models.
And Alex, one quick point to add to Preston's. The cost of actually recruiting patients for a trial is actually not insubstantial, and it takes a lot of time. So this volunteer vaccine corps, a pre-consented, highly informed group that is ready to step into action and join these trials, could actually save certainly time, but even a lot of money. It could be a significant savings, I think.
Sure.
Can I add just one quick comment to this? And that is, of course, it's remarkable how these conversations of cost unfold. And, for a kind of open source project that's doing this on a shoestring without significant access to capital, of course, cost matters. And yet, the costs of this pandemic are just unfathomable, right? Measure it in currency, but also measure it in, lives lost, both because of death, but also because of being knocked off a trajectory of being compromised in any number of ways. The recovery is going to be absolutely profound and decadal. And so, it's really striking to me how the inputs into innovation, whose purpose is to provide, to secure life And it seems to me development of vaccines is about as fundamental a kind of, biologically collective good, but also sort of socially and morally, where, I mean, the sort of costs of inaction are actually very profound. So it strikes me that that's the big picture within which questions about cost should be located. And furthermore, because of the ways in which, as Ms. Paulus was pointing to, I mean, the ways in which we're thinking inside of a box and therefore have boxed ourselves in, there is a tendency to construct the relationship with research participants and the kinds of obligations to those participants and therefore associated costs in very particular terms. Some in the chat, there were comparisons being drawn between challenge trials and military service. But, participation in clinical research is actually a very strange domain insofar as, the main sort of provision of its obligation, of a duty to the participant is to seek their informed consent rather than to take responsibility for what effects there may be. And in the context of a challenge trial, even where risk is, pretty well understood and mitigated, there can be harms that are long-term. So it seems to me absolutely appropriate that one might think about participation in such a thing for the sake of the collective good as also entitling one to commitments from the collective, whereby the costs borne by an individual would be, there would be a promise of redress for those, in the form of healthcare for the rest of your life or whatever it is. And yet somehow that's not part of the conversation. Instead, we talk about informedness, we talk about the agency of the participant in the trial. If we think about these as expressions of solidarity rather than expressions of individual rationality and agency, then we may think about the obligations that we collectively bring to them, and in a different way, and costs, in a sense, become a different category. In this sense, and I think this is a much deeper problem, this is a problem of political imagination about about the ways we're in it together and the ways in which that being in it together, the fact of being in it together, demands particular kinds of collective response and collective commitments to those who are prepared to put themselves in danger for the sake of the larger collective. And that seems to me, if we have that conversation within the box, and doing it on a shoestring, open source style, is a function of being in the box. It's trying to get out of the box, but the constraints are also imposed upon that kind of project, virtuous though it may be. I think we need to rethink the ways in which we constitute these infrastructures and the costs associated with failures of imagination in their constitution, because it is what gives us the world that we're in at present.
I think that's a really important point, that on multiple levels, this failure of imagination to break existing paradigms. And I think in the US we had Operation Warp Speed, which was a way of rethinking vaccine development, but still very much within the box. And the impact of that were evident and measurable in human lives, and in the time it took. As Dr. Estep pointed out, the vaccines that existed, designed in days, not months, not years, took months and ultimately will take years for most people to access. So we're still very much thinking, globally within that box. And so I do welcome ideas of or discussion, right? Even just framing these problems of where the box needs to be opened and the directions in which the box needs to be opened. So thank you for those comments. I do want to address some of the questions that have come in from our audience. One question about challenge trials: can they be purposefully targeted to volunteers who are least likely to die from contracting the disease, i.e., people without comorbidities, people who are younger? Would this affect or disrupt the outcomes or sort of the statistical significance of those studies?
So I'll maybe jump in and say quickly,
sure.
The design I mentioned earlier was exactly like that. So that makes a crucial difference in terms of the risk that for each volunteer, the risk that in the cohort there will be an accident. It greatly reduces this. yes, that would be the way to go. I've also mentioned it raises the question, how do we then generalize the findings to other populations? And I've mentioned the way it's one possible use, and people mentioned other possible uses of the correlates of protection. That's one possible use of the correlates of protection, to generalize from that group where safety is higher to other groups. I also wanted to say one word on the previous strand, if I may, just to expand another way in which challenge trials could be used in the spirit of open access and sharing. Meta Rostenberg, a challenge trialist from the Netherlands, and colleagues say that because challenge trials they happen in a lab, they're standardizable in ways that field trials are not. Field trials are very much the exposures in a field trial are very much a function of the viral strains in the trial site, the culture of close quarters or big dwellings in the around the trial sites, etc. Challenge trials can be standardized. You give the same amount of culture to each participant, and you can select the participants to be similar medical profiles in different challenge trials. Thanks to that, we can, if we want, create a global, from individual challenge trials, create a kind of global one big challenge trial that compares many different vaccines to each other, many different dosing regimens to each other. So you have the ideas, say we start with one challenge trial for one vaccine versus placebo. The next trial, which might happen in a different continent, gives the same amount of culture of the same, the very same virus that comes from the same source culture to a different group of people, and has no control arm. There's no placebo. You don't need placebo arms. Are it's a few more people. It's more expensive, and it's also more dangerous because they don't get the hope of vaccine protection. You don't need to risk more people in a placebo arm because you can now compare to the placebo arm of the previous trial on the assumption that you've standardized everything. And you can go on and on and on with that original placebo arm and use it for many trials, and it would cut both money and risk.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've had, by the way, dozens of questions that come in. I don't think we're going to have time for all of them. So if you're in the audience and a question hasn't been responded to, please bear with us. I think we're going to get to as many as we can, but I think there'll be ways in which we can continue this dialogue after this conference. Certainly, ways to get in touch with both us at RaDVaC and with the many panelists that we have with us. So one question that I think might be best directed to Dr. Hurlbut. Many critics of suspending vaccine patents or other IP say that long-term vaccine innovation ultimately will be harmed, and that only large pharma or large pharmaceutical companies can afford to suspend patents, essentially providing subsidies with their other drugs and other revenue streams. Small companies and countries who can't afford these subsidies would be harmed. How might we help these vulnerable people today without incurring this kind of long-term harm of those vulnerable people?
So I'm not an expert on patent law or the economics thereof, but let me just say that it seems to me that this is the, anytime you talk about, the double-digit profits of the pharmaceutical industry, or you talk about any kinds of constraints on intellectual property, the response is always promising a future that will come into being if the status quo is kept in place, and threatening that future won't, right? We will deny ourselves innovation. And the number of things that get authorized by the notion that if any constraint is placed, if there's any, if we shift from privatization to socialization in any sort of way, it will sort of deny us future benefits. I mean, it strikes me simply as a red herring, because first of all, many of those future benefits, if you just look back at the record of promises, they don't come to pass. Others certainly do come to pass, but of course, the relationship between the privatized, if we're talking about COVID vaccines, I mean, the privatized objects of intellectual property, of course, are complex amalgams of public and private investment. And the modality of privatization is an infrastructure that we put in place, 3-4 decades ago, roughly, that built upon, at least in the US, built on a kind of a commitment to, or a presumption that privatization, that incentivization, that the machinery of the market is the most effective modality. But it seems to me that we have to ask more fundamental questions than, is an abrogation of a regime of intellectual property in one domain for one moment going to, put cracks into that edifice, which strikes me as itself pretty speculative. And ask, is this the edifice that we actually want built here? Of course, there's a role for the private sector, absolutely. But the private sector is publicly constituted, especially in this domain. I mean, intellectual property is the conferring of monopoly in the name of public benefit. And we should be asking our questions about that regime in terms of public benefit, because if that regime is getting in the way, then there are many other ways we could imagine of incentivizing innovation, if indeed we want to continue with a kind of privatized regime. Or maybe vaccines, especially vaccines for potentially pandemic viruses, are simply a public good, and we should think about those the way we think about railroad infrastructure or highways or other kinds of public infrastructures that for which the privatization, even though there is a move in the direction of privatization proves to be actually not such a great way to provide public infrastructures. So the question, I would throw back the question and say, can we imagine possibilities rather than assert fears, I think unfounded fears, about the disruption of what then becomes a kind of naturalized order that we simply presume to be the only way? There are interests in constructing that order as a natural order. I think that the open source is actually a pretty interesting. The Linux analogy is a pretty interesting, because the forms of creativity and innovation that came through an open source organization of development of digital technology is a kind of a case in point where a domain of creativity is unlocked, but over against open is the opposite of closed. And maybe we don't need open or closed. Maybe we need a different kind of ecology where what we're producing are not consumer goods. These are not consumer goods. These are technologies for securing life. These are a public good.
Yeah, and we've had multiple people write in either in question or comment form about framing vaccines as public good. And I know that various policy institutions around the world had opened this up as a question. So I do want to circle back to Ms. Paulus. Do you have anything to add to Ben's answer, or to the question of what can policy making institutions, or what can governing institutions do to help prevent this sort of long-term risk of driving down innovation as a result of perhaps leaving IP off the table when it comes to vaccine development?
Well, actually, I don't really believe that we are leaving so much off the table, because when we're looking at, especially in the pharmaceutical sector, at what innovation is taking place, where is the money going, to put it very bluntly, then the main money, at least in Europe, the main money is going towards cancer research with targeted antibodies, where you have therapy costs of several thousand euros per treatment, and people have to take it, I don't know, twice a week or something. So you have immense cost. And I've worked in a lab working on this clinical, on the analysis of clinical trial samples. And so I read quite a few study protocols on that. And often it was sufficient if the life of the patient was prolonged by 3 months, at an immense cost. And in Germany, 40% of the whole medication cost that the social security system is paying for medication is going into cancer. Of course, cancer is an important field where we have to help people and all that, no doubt. But there are other things or other diseases that are just as important and where we need urgent action, and action is just not taken because it's not profitable enough. So if you look at it from a public health perspective, then we only can say, well, it is not working. The free market is not working on providing health to most people. I just tried to look it up on the internet, but there doesn't seem to be a translation already. There's this wonderful book by Maya Göpel, who is head of the scientific council in Germany, who is giving advice to the government, and it's called Rethinking Our World. And that's exactly what she does in that book, because she says what we're doing is actually not profitable if we count on the other side what we're doing in destroying natural resources. These have a value too. And if you just count the value of, let's say, the wood in the forest, or how much would you have to pay to clean up the water, which nature does just for free by having wetlands and peatlands and which are filtering the water, then we are having a net negative value from our economic activities. And she says, whenever she's talking to people from the economic sector about it, they're just like, well, but doing it differently doesn't fit in our models. And then she says, well, are we going to destroy our resources of life just because we don't find models? Are you being serious? And I think just by turning the question around, not by, well, how shall we do it, but by asking, well, what is your approach then? She has brought quite a few people to rethinking the world, actually, but there doesn't seem to be an English translation of the book yet. Maybe there will be one in future. It would be very, very helpful, I guess. And also there's Christian Ferber from Austria, who has a great model of common good economy, it's called. And he says, well, what we should do actually is to have not only the economic balance sheet, but also a common goods balance sheet. So that if you, for example, have a negative impact on, let's say, biodiversity, or if you have a lot of emissions and all that, then this counts negative on your common goods balance sheet. And the goal is to have a lot of good points, of course, on your common goods balance sheet. And you're also supposed to trade only with companies that also have a common goods balance sheet. And then you could end up, for example, with having a bank that says, okay, if you have a good common goods balance sheet, then you will receive a better interest rate. So that could be an approach of kind of combining both worlds, the purely economic world that doesn't look for what is happening in the long term, and also the world that is looking at the values that cannot be properly monetarized. I don't know whether I put it very well or whether it was understandable.
No, I think I understood. So essentially, opening the the equation or the assessment of worth or value to beyond simply dollars, but also to social and in the case of vaccines, in health benefits, right? So the impact on public health, and a way of quantifying and assessing the value of those public health contributions, and then tying them to some kind of incentive, right? Whether it's access to well, I don't know. I mean, perhaps that's a question for the group. What could incentivize participants in a model that is not necessarily profit driven, right? I mean, we know that at least for the past many decades, vaccines have primarily been produced and tested and distributed by kind of centralized, very well-funded pharmaceutical companies with, profit directives, right, or mandates to produce profits for their shareholders. And obviously, because vaccine development has been traditionally a very expensive endeavor, it's been almost a practice that is exclusive to these companies who can afford it. In the absence of, perhaps public dollars, or rather, with the support of some public dollars, certainly, but that this development has been largely funded, subsidized by the other revenue streams of these pharmaceutical companies. So how then, if we are to rethink this model, and this is a question perhaps for Dr. Estep, but for others as well, how do we incentivize people to participate in a model that they may not directly profit from? I know that Dr. Estep, you in your opening statements, presented the analogy of Linux, right? Of Linux and Android operating systems and software that had massive participation and have forked into multiple technologies and multiple user applications and even hardware, without necessarily every person engaging in that development process with an incentive to themselves.
Well, I'd like to point out that in vaccines in the world that we entered in early 2020, nobody wanted anything more than vaccines, right? Money progressively lost its value, and vaccines became for educated people about vaccines and their safety and the importance of vaccines to stabilizing the world as we had known it. So vaccines are another important public good with enormous value, right? So we don't have to think about everything in monetary value. So one of the things that we've done, though, is that we've granted regulatory authorities like the FDA and the EMA a monopoly power over the allowance of use of vaccines, right? And I think it's I'm glad for many of the functions that the FDA plays and the EMA and the normal sort of vetting functions that they play. But I don't think that they should have monopoly power over vaccine access. And in fact, they don't in some cases. And with RaDVaC, we showed what one of those cases is. So self-administration, production and self-administration of vaccines. We've been told by many legal experts that the FDA does not have the authority to prevent us from doing that. So we used that one loophole to allow us to access to this social good, these social riches, right? But we needed to, we were technically adept. We were a network of people who had a skill set that was not common, and so this advantage was not widely available. So what I would like to see is a loosening of the regulatory framework, or at least an expansion of the regulatory framework that allows people who are fully informed and consented about vaccines, the dangers, the safety, the history of vaccines, to have much more ready access to vaccines in times of need.
Interesting. Yeah. I know that many people have spoken or written about RaDVaC as kind of an anti-authoritarian movement or project, and I think one of the ways that we conceptualize it is very much not anti-authoritarian, but sort of alternative, right? That we need to rethink, or that we've begun to rethink the mechanisms of authority and sort of the reach of authority as it pertains to individual self-experimentation and people engaging in research. So.
And most importantly, and and many people, many allies of RaDVaC who've supported what we've done, have pointed out basically the same things that we pointed out in the introduction with the trolley problem, that RaDVaC is acting rationally, right? That this is not an irrational or an act of bravery. We did the numbers. We believed the science. We looked at the clinical trials. We looked at the decades of research publications. We don't see the extreme danger that is generally presented, as potentially exists in vaccines, in experimental vaccines. There just aren't those kinds of dangers. They don't exist. SARS-CoV-2 was an exceptionally dangerous pathogen, and even looking at the nadir, the very low point of safety of public vaccination campaigns, there's nothing even close to the danger of SARS-CoV-2 in vaccines. So, I think that part of the problem is that regulatory agencies are not acting rationally, but they're saying that they're saying that they have an expectation that the public will lose trust if they don't do certain things. So what they're saying is that they know that the public, or they expect the public to be innumerate and irrational, and so that they prevent all people from having access to vaccines based on that innumeracy and irrationality. And I don't think that's a situation that we can tolerate. We need to find an alternative mechanism for people who believe in science and believe in the history and safety of vaccines to have access to vaccines as soon as possible, so that we can start demonstrating very early on in outbreaks that vaccines are much safer than this presumption of that accompanies this year-long wait for the rollout of vaccines.
Absolutely. And one quick thing about that demonstration of safety, we could even try to encourage regulatory agencies to allow hyper-informed people to do this and to gather information, like a kind of open trial registry. It doesn't have to be that complicated. It can be done safely. And it's a way of making this more than simply giving people access the way you give people access to vitamin C. So it's got to be a little bit more serious than that, of course. But it's not that complicated to have just this simple, formal gathering of data. It's sort of like ultimately a post-marketing study. Just people are taking it, they're gathering the data and reporting it to the FDA.
Yeah, I think it might be valuable to. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just one quick thing. It's actually there are a lot of restrictions in the United States, but the FDA is actually the most, or among the most, libertarian of regulatory agencies when it comes to vaccines around the world. I've looked into this as my role as in my role as clinical trials liaison, and I'm a Swedish citizen. So in Sweden, I certainly can't make this and give it to people, but I can't make it and give it to myself. I can't even make it. I can't even buy microcentrifuge tubes without going to Amazon.uk. So the FDA could be a little bit more open. That might be the place to start, but it really has to be done globally, ideally.
Very
Can I have
of course, please.
comment here? So I worry about the rational, irrational characterization and the notion that this is all merely about informedness. That back of our regulatory structure is a particular kind of imagination of the right separation of powers and the concentration of competencies associated with it, right? I mean, so the FDA came into being in the early 20th century in response to what was basically an open source pharmaceutical industry, the sort of patent medicine industry. And the idea was, well, what we're going to do is preserve the market, but we're going to regulate information and therefore informedness. We're going to create informed consumers by, making sure that what's on the bottle is true and that people can thereby make informed decisions about whether they want to drink the poison or not. But the sort of space of the market was preserved. And, of course, that has evolved and changed, but the emphasis has been on information and ultimately then on safety and efficacy, which is still about information. but consumer protection imagines a consumer as a essentially free agent operating in a market where the object of regulation is the drug itself, right? And the information associated with the drug. What that has invited is a kind of a regime of skepticism in which the consumer is supposed to understand that the producer is really out just to make a buck, and the FDA is standing in the middle, and the FDA is the guarantor of epistemic correctness, basically, of good knowledge about the thing. There's a political relationship in that, right? Where consumer skepticism is a desirable part of that regime. So, to sort of call a public which is vaccine hesitant irrational, when at the same time that same public has been for years told to, question your medical provider, is the test an unnecessary test, be skeptical in all such and such ways, be informed, Google it on the web, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's all about information and skepticism. I mean, that is a regime of governance that we have produced. So the subjectivity of the irrational consumer is actually a kind of cultivated rationality. And the limits of protection that are provided by by regulators depends upon that kind of expression of agency, rational or irrational. So it's not as easy. I mean, if you step back and you think about it from the perspective of public health, I mean, it looks in principle different. And so, I mean, we might think about the development of vaccines not in terms of the production of a technology whose safety is unequivocally certified such that now it can be dumped into the market and they go for the sort of free-for-all, but rather in terms of the kind of collectivization or the socialization of risk in the name of the collectivization and the socialization of benefit, which might invite a very different regulatory structure. So my point is that those terms, rationality and irrationality, it seems to me are reinscriptions of the box in certain regards. And we have to remember how deeply we are committed to these relationships culturally. I mean, they're sort of, they're sort of in our very bones because we have grown up in them. And in a sense, everything is done within them, and yet they were made. And they can be unmade, right? And moments like this, it seems to me, are moments in which we should ask, was what we made then the right medicine for us now? And that requires a kind of political reimagination, not merely a kind of reconstruction of what kind of risk tolerance is rational, and what sort of, and what sort of data is the right kind of data to authorize the biomedical intervention.
Sure, and I think it's kind of key to think about this as a problem of public trust as well. And I think you framed that very well, insofar as the public is, it's very clear that there is a public, perhaps global mistrust or lack of trust. And it might be a small percentage, but still that percentage is high enough to interfere with the efficacy and the success of vaccination campaigns. There is a distrust or a skepticism for both drugs and vaccines, which are essentially preventative technologies. So yeah, rethinking ways to address that trust issue. And it's interesting you brought up, and I'd love to hear another perspective on this, understanding that we're getting close to the end of our time for this panel, but potentially the role of that open source or non-proprietary drug development and in our case vaccine development could play in reestablishing or reframing the transparency and ultimately the trust in the incentives at play in that development. So I don't know if Dr. Eyal, you look like you've been captivated in thought throughout this conversation. I'd love to get some of your remarks.
On the open source or on the incentives aspect, I might add just a suggestion to look at at a particular project on the possibility of subjecting the remuneration that drug companies in general, not just for vaccines, drug companies get based on the impact on the global burden of disease from their interventions and products, even interventions like easing the delivery of existing interventions. If you look up the Health Impact Fund, if you Google up Health Impact Fund, that's a project where people have given a lot of thought to how to do that, and you'll see a world of work on sort of financial monetary incentives, but not for the purposes of ameliorating, addressing the anxieties of the rich, but of the purposes of humanity when we do those things. I'm afraid that I thought that we are ending now, and I have another meeting that I need to bow out for. So
that's quite all right.
It was a pleasure, many interesting thoughts, and hope to continue the conversation with everybody.
Thank you very much for your contributions. Yeah, it was great having you. Brian, I think you have your hand up in Zoom. It looks like
yes.
You have something to say.
It worked. You noticed.
It does.
Very quickly, Ben, I actually strongly agree with you about the importance of thinking through, just to put it in the way we do in the humanities, our constitution as subjects, how we are kind of interpolated into this whole realm of thinking. I think that's critically important. But the reason that we've been focusing on this particular aspect of the irrationality of risk assessment is in some ways, not only because we actually think it could save lives directly, but it's not really either or. I think doing this can kind of slap people out of can help to slap people out of their dogmatic slumber of just thinking in the way that we do in general, and accepting the political choices that are given to us. So I don't think it has to be either or. I think we can actually use this as a spur to change the way vaccines are trialed, but also to get us to think in different ways about our political and regulatory choices, ultimately.
I mean, to agree strongly with that, it's sort of the claiming of a monopoly on rationality and the diagnosis of irrationality that's the problem. It's opening it up. Yeah, absolutely.
Got it.
Sure. So, again, we're over time, but I do have one question that I do want to open to everyone, but perhaps to direct to Ms. Paulus. We live in a time when clearly some of this thinking is considered fairly radical, right? And certainly from a policy perspective, the notion of challenge trials are quite controversial. The notion of opening vaccine development as public international goods is still quite controversial, or at least fairly unprecedented in modern times. Is there anything that we and I say that as RaDVaC, as an organization who's committed to developing tools for other people to use, and then we as citizens, right? We as American citizens, and actually looking at our attendee list, we have representation from 6 continents right now. So what can individuals do to motivate the discussion at the policy level to begin reframing vaccine development as something that is worth investing in alternative models, right? That accepting that, or rather understanding that our current models have gaps, have shortcomings and pitfalls, and I think that's clearly felt in the global South, whereas in the global North, perhaps it's less felt. But what can we as individuals do to help motivate the kind of policy changes, or at least elevate it to policy level discussions, the way you have with the WHO and with the EU Parliament? Is it writing open letters? Is it do we harass politicians on Twitter? What is the way into these policy discussions that seem so rare, at least to us?
Well, if I really knew that, I would be really glad. I think it's sometimes it's small things like setting examples. I don't know whether you've heard of the German energy transition, so to speak, which actually started in around 2000 with a renewable energy law, and it was basically setting up a feed-in tariff. And this feed-in tariff was just designed so that people would get their money back, so to speak. So if you would invest, for example, in solar PV to be put on your roof, then you would receive for 20 years, you would receive a fixed price for your electricity. And well, all the big electricity companies looked at the law and said, well, this is crap, because we will only make 1 or 2 interest points. This is no one will be interested in that. No one will do that, and that we won't invest in it either. And funnily, a lot of people out there said, well, I want to do something on climate change. I want to do something on the energy transition. I don't care. I don't want to earn huge amounts of money with that. And that was something that the big companies underestimated. And until our current government put in some brakes on this movement, in part, more than 50% of renewable capacity was in the hands of citizens, of farmers, of ordinary people that did not want to earn a lot of money, but wanted to do something good. And that fits very well with other stories I have heard of people traveling the world with very little money on their bike, and who said, we have been helped by people all over the world. People want to do good. And I think it's the job of politics of making it possible to do good and earn a living by the way. And I think if people can make their politicians aware that it might be more important caring for the future of the children and grandchildren and not destroying the biosphere, then we would be already one step into the right direction. How we will actually achieve something like ending injustice and all that, I don't know. I'm not a philosopher, but I think the RaDVaC project shows what potential is there, because people just want to do something to help the community. Thanks.